Welcome. Tonight we are going to talk about Alexander the Great. On a warm summer night in the year 356 BCE, in the ancient kingdom of Macedon, a child was born who would change the course of human history. The palace of Pella, nestled in the fertile plains of northern Greece, echoed with the cries of a newborn prince. His mother, Queen Olympias, a princess from the wild mountain kingdom of Epirus, held her son close as thunder rumbled in the distance. His father, King Philip II of Macedon, was away at war, as he so often was, expanding his kingdom's borders and securing its future. The child was named Alexander, and from the very moment of his birth, legends began to gather around him like morning mist around a mountain peak. The ancient historians tell us that on the night Alexander was born, the great temple of Artemis at Ephesus, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, burned to the ground. Some said this was an omen, that the goddess had been too distracted by the birth of a future king to protect her own sacred place. Whether this story is true or merely a tale woven by those who came after, it speaks to how Alexander's life would be remembered as something extraordinary, something touched by the divine, something that burned so brightly it could not help but cast long shadows across history. Macedonia in those days was not the powerful empire it would become. It was a rough kingdom on the edges of the Greek world, looked down upon by the sophisticated city-states to the south. Athens with its philosophers and poets, Sparta with its legendary warriors, Thebes with its sacred band of elite soldiers. The Macedonians spoke Greek, but with an accent that marked them as outsiders. They were seen as half-barbarians, country folk who had not yet learned the refined ways of civilized Greeks. Their kings ruled from simple palaces, not the marble temples of Athens. Their soldiers fought as their ancestors had, with long spears and cavalry charges, not the carefully orchestrated phalanx formations that the southern Greeks had perfected. But Philip II had ambitions. He had spent time in Thebes as a young man, held hostage to guarantee his kingdom's good behavior, and there he had learned. He studied the military innovations of Epaminondas, the great Theban general. He watched how the elite soldiers trained, how they moved in battle, how they broke the enemy lines. And when he returned to Macedon and seized the throne, he brought those lessons with him. He reformed the Macedonian army, creating a new kind of military force that combined the best of everything he had learned. The result was the Macedonian phalanx, rows of soldiers wielding 18-foot pikes called sarissas, their shields locked together, advancing like an unstoppable wall of bronze and iron. This was the world into which Alexander was born, a world of ambition and warfare, of gods and heroes, of ancient grudges and new possibilities. From his earliest days, he was shaped by 2 powerful forces, his father's military genius and his mother's passionate intensity. Philip was a man of the world, practical and strategic, a king who understood power and how to wield it. Olympias was something altogether different, mystical, emotional, devoted to the old gods and ancient rituals. She told young Alexander that he was descended from heroes, that the blood of Achilles ran through his veins on her side, and the blood of Heracles on his father's. These were not just stories to her. They were truth, and she raised her son to believe them with every fiber of his being. Alexander grew up in the royal palace of Pella, a place of stone courtyards and painted walls, where servants hurried through dim corridors and soldiers stood guard at every gate. He was not an only child. He had a sister, Cleopatra, and later a half-brother named Philip Aridaeus. Though this boy was said to be simple-minded, perhaps deliberately poisoned in his youth by enemies at court. The palace was a place of intrigue and danger, where every smile might hide a dagger and every friendship might be bought with gold. But for a young prince, it was also a place of wonder and learning. From an early age, Alexander showed signs of the remarkable man he would become. The ancient sources tell us he was small for his age, not the towering hero we might imagine, but compact and strong, with golden hair and eyes of different colors, one blue, one brown, a condition called heterochromia that only added to his mystique. He had a melodious voice and a quick mind, absorbing lessons with an intensity that impressed his tutors. He learned to ride almost before he could walk properly, and he showed no fear of horses, even the most spirited ones. There is a famous story from his childhood that reveals much about his character. A horse dealer came to Philip's court with a magnificent black stallion named Bucephalus, which means ox head in Greek, named for the shape of the white mark on his forehead. This horse was beautiful and powerful, but wild. No one could ride him. Philip's horsemen tried and failed, and the king was about to send the animal away as useless when young Alexander, who was perhaps 10 or 12 years old at the time, spoke up. He said he could tame the horse, and his father, amused, told him to try. If he succeeded, Philip would buy the horse for him. If he failed, Alexander would have to pay for the horse himself, a fortune that the boy did not have. Alexander had noticed something that the experienced horseman had not. The horse was afraid of his own shadow. So the boy turned the horse to face the sun, where the shadow fell behind him and out of sight. He spoke gently to the animal, stroking his neck, and then, in one smooth motion, he mounted. The horse, no longer frightened, allowed the boy to ride him. Alexander galloped across the field, and when he returned, his father had tears in his eyes. "My son," Philip said, "you must seek a kingdom worthy of you. Macedonia is too small." Bucephalus became Alexander's beloved companion. The horse would carry him through every major battle of his campaigns, across rivers and deserts, through the mountains of Afghanistan and onto the plains of India. When Bucephalus finally died, many years later in India, an old horse who had carried his master across the known world, Alexander would weep and found a city in his honor. But that was still far in the future. For now they were boy and horse, beginning their journey together. When Alexander was 13 years old, his father made a decision that would shape the rest of his life. Philip invited Aristotle, one of the greatest philosophers in Greece, to come to Macedon and tutor the young prince. Aristotle was in his 40s then, already famous for his studies under Plato in Athens, already beginning to develop his own philosophical system that would influence Western thought for the next 2,000 years. He agreed to come, and Philip gave him a beautiful place for his school, the sanctuary of the nymphs at Macedon, a secluded spot of gardens and groves, with clear springs and shaded walks, perfect for contemplation and study. For 3 years, from age 13 to 16, Alexander studied with Aristotle at Macedon. He was not alone. A small group of noble Macedonian boys studied with him, sons of Philip's generals and advisors. Among them were boys who would become Alexander's closest companions and greatest generals: Hephaestion, who would be his dearest friend; Ptolemy, who would found the dynasty that ruled Egypt for 3 centuries; Cassander, who would later play a darker role in the story; Nearchus, who would command his fleet, and others. Together, they learned everything that Greek civilization had to offer. Aristotle taught them philosophy and ethics, logic and rhetoric. He taught them about the natural world, about animals and plants, about the heavens and the earth, about how to observe and categorize the wonders of creation. He taught them medicine and biology, drawing on his father's knowledge. Aristotle's father had been a physician to the Macedonian court. He taught them literature, and Alexander fell in love with Homer's Iliad, particularly the character of Achilles, the greatest warrior of the Greeks at Troy. Alexander kept a copy of the Iliad with him for the rest of his life, sleeping with it under his pillow along with a dagger. In Achilles, he saw a model for his own life, a hero who chose glory over long life, who achieved immortality through his deeds even though he died young. But Aristotle also taught them something that would have profound consequences. He taught them that the Greeks were superior to other peoples, that the barbarians, anyone who was not Greek, were naturally suited to be slaves or subjects. He taught them that Greek culture was the pinnacle of human achievement, that spreading Greek civilization to the rest of the world would be a noble endeavor. These lessons sank deep into Alexander's mind, though he would interpret them in his own way. Unlike his teacher, Alexander would come to believe that the best of all cultures could be blended together, that a Persian noble could be as worthy as a Macedonian, that the gods of different peoples might be the same gods with different names. But that understanding would only come later, forged in the fires of conquest and empire. The years at Macedon passed like a dream, a golden time of learning and friendship. Alexander absorbed everything Aristotle taught him and demanded more. He wrote to his tutor asking for advanced texts, for secret knowledge, for the deepest wisdom. When Aristotle later published some of his more esoteric teachings, Alexander supposedly wrote to him in complaint, saying that what had been their special knowledge was now available to everyone. Even then, the young prince had a hunger to be extraordinary, to possess what others did not have. But these peaceful years could not last forever. When Alexander was 16, his education was cut short. Philip needed him. The king was planning a major campaign, and he wanted his son at his side. Alexander left the sanctuary of the nymphs and returned to the harsh world of war and politics. He would never see Aristotle as a student again, though they would correspond for years, and Alexander would send his old teacher specimens of plants and animals from the far corners of the world he conquered. At 16, Alexander was given his first command. While Philip was away besieging a city, he left his teenage son as regent of Macedon, with full authority to govern the kingdom in his absence. It was an extraordinary show of faith, and Alexander did not disappoint. When a Thracian tribe called the Maedae rebelled, threatening Macedon's northern border, the young prince led an army against them. He defeated them decisively, drove them from their lands, and founded a city on the spot, which he named Alexandropolis, the city of Alexander. It was the first of many cities that would bear his name. 2 years later, at the Battle of Chaeronea, Alexander commanded the Macedonian cavalry in the decisive battle that would make Philip the master of Greece. The armies of Athens and Thebes, the great city-states that had looked down on Macedon for so long, stood against Philip's forces. It was a fierce battle, and at a crucial moment, Alexander led his cavalry in a charge that broke through the Theban lines. The sacred band of Thebes, that elite unit of 300 warriors famous throughout Greece, stood their ground and fought to the last man. They were cut down where they stood, refusing to retreat, and Alexander was said to have wept when he saw their bodies afterward. So brave and so futile was their resistance. The victory at Chaeronea changed everything. Philip was now the most powerful man in Greece. The city-states had no choice but to accept him as their leader. He formed them into the League of Corinth, with himself as hegemon, supreme commander. Only Sparta refused to join, sulking in isolation in the Peloponnese, still dreaming of its ancient glory. Philip announced his grand plan. He would lead a united Greek army to invade Persia, to take revenge for the Persian invasions of Greece that had happened 150 years earlier, to free the Greek cities of Asia Minor from Persian rule, and, though he did not say this quite so openly, to loot the fabulous wealth of the East. But Philip would never lead that expedition. In 336 BCE, at the height of his power, at a moment when everything he had worked for seemed within his grasp, Philip II of Macedon was assassinated. It happened at a wedding, of all places, his daughter's wedding. Philip was celebrating, relaxed and happy, when a young man named Pausanias, one of his own bodyguards, rushed forward and stabbed him with a dagger. The king died almost instantly. Pausanias tried to flee but was caught and killed by other guards. The reason for the assassination has been debated for more than 2,000 years. Was it a personal grudge? Pausanias had supposedly been humiliated by one of Philip's favorites and had sought justice from the king, but Philip had done nothing. Was it a conspiracy? Some whispered that Olympias had been involved, that she feared Philip would set her aside in favor of his new wife. He had recently married again, to a young Macedonian noblewoman named Cleopatra. Some even whispered that Alexander himself knew of the plot, though most historians doubt this. Whatever the truth, Philip was dead, and Alexander, at 20 years old, found himself suddenly king of Macedon. It was a dangerous moment. Several of Philip's other sons by other wives might have claimed the throne. Some of Philip's generals, older men who had fought with him for decades, might have resented taking orders from a boy barely out of his teens. The Greek city-states, which had submitted to Philip, might have seen his death as an opportunity to rebel. The northern tribes, always restless, might have seen weakness and attacked. Alexander acted with decisive speed. Within days of his father's death, he had secured the loyalty of the army. He had potential rivals eliminated, a brutal necessity in those times, though we do not know if he ordered these deaths himself or if zealous supporters acted on what they thought were his wishes. He had his father's new wife and her infant son killed, removing another potential rival. These were dark deeds, the kind of ruthless acts that kingship sometimes demanded in the ancient world. Olympias was almost certainly involved in some of these killings, protecting her son's claim to the throne with a mother's fierce determination. Alexander then moved to secure his position. He marched south to Thessaly and Thermopylae, reminding the Greeks that Macedonia was still powerful, that the son was as formidable as the father. Most of the Greek states quickly confirmed him as their hegemon, just as his father had been. But not Thebes. Thebes rebelled, encouraged by rumors that Alexander had been killed in fighting in the north. It was a fatal mistake. Alexander marched on Thebes with terrible speed. He offered the city one last chance to surrender, to hand over the ringleaders of the rebellion. Thebes refused. The siege was short but brutal. When Alexander's forces broke through the walls, they showed no mercy. On Alexander's orders, or perhaps simply unleashed by him and then impossible to stop, the Macedonian soldiers and their Greek allies destroyed the city. They killed thousands, sold tens of thousands more into slavery, and razed the city to the ground. Only the temples and the house of the poet Pindar were spared. It was a message to all of Greece. Rebellion would not be tolerated. The destruction of Thebes shocked the Greek world, but it also ensured that no other city would dare to rise against Alexander. Athens, which had been supporting Thebes with words, if not with soldiers, hastily sent ambassadors to apologize and pledge loyalty. With Greece secured, Alexander could turn his attention to the great project his father had begun, the invasion of Persia. The Persian Empire was the largest the world had ever seen. It stretched from Egypt to India, from the shores of the Mediterranean to the steppes of Central Asia. It was wealthy beyond imagination, its kings ruling from magnificent palaces, its lands producing gold and silver, silk and spices. For 200 years, Persia had been the greatest power in the world. Its kings called themselves the King of Kings, and when they spoke, nations trembled. But Persia had its problems. The empire was too large to govern effectively. Communication was slow. It could take weeks or months for orders from the capital to reach distant provinces. The Persian army was massive but unwieldy, relying heavily on Greek mercenaries and subject peoples who fought because they had to, not because they wanted to. The current king, Darius III, was by all accounts a decent man, brave in his own way, concerned for his family, a good administrator in peacetime. But he was not a warrior king. He had not been raised expecting to rule. He had become king only through a series of accidents and assassinations that had wiped out the main line of the royal family. Now he found himself facing the most dangerous military commander of the age, and he was not prepared for it. In the spring of 334 BCE, Alexander crossed the Hellespont, the narrow strait that divides Europe from Asia, at the head of an army of about 35,000 men. It was not an enormous force by ancient standards, but it was superbly trained and equipped. The core of it was the Macedonian phalanx, those soldiers with their 18-foot pikes, capable of forming an almost impenetrable wall of spear points. There were the companion cavalry, the elite horsemen commanded by Alexander himself, drawn from the Macedonian nobility. There were Thessalian cavalry, Greek hoplites, Thracian and Illyrian light infantry, archers and slingers. It was a combined arms force that could fight in any terrain, against any enemy. According to legend, when Alexander crossed into Asia, he threw his spear into the beach, claiming the land as his by right of conquest. He also made a pilgrimage to Troy, site of the great war sung by Homer. There he ran naked around the tomb of Achilles, an old tradition, and laid a wreath at the hero's monument. His dear friend Hephaestion laid a wreath at the tomb of Patroclus, Achilles' companion. The symbolism was clear. Alexander saw himself as the new Achilles, come to Asia to win glory and honor. Like Achilles, he would achieve immortality through his deeds, and like Achilles, he would die young, far from home. The first major battle came quickly. A Persian force commanded by the satraps, governors of the western provinces, met Alexander at the river Granicus. The Persians held the far bank, their position strong. Alexander's generals advised caution, perhaps even waiting until the next day to attack. But Alexander would not wait. He plunged into the river on horseback, his companion cavalry following him, and charged up the muddy bank directly into the Persian lines. It was an incredibly risky move. He could have been killed in the first moments of the battle, and that would have been the end of his invasion, the end of everything. In fact, he very nearly was killed. A Persian nobleman struck him on the head with a sword, cracking his helmet and stunning him. As the Persian raised his weapon for a killing blow, one of Alexander's companions, Clytus, cut the man down, saving the king's life. It was a debt that Alexander would not forget, though it would later lead to tragedy. The Battle of the Granicus was a complete victory for Alexander. The Persian cavalry was routed, and the Greek mercenaries fighting for Persia, who had stood their ground, were slaughtered to the last man. a warning to other Greeks not to fight against their own people. Alexander sent 300 suits of Persian armor back to Athens to be dedicated in the Parthenon with an inscription. Alexander, son of Philip, and all the Greeks except the Spartans, present this offering from the spoils taken from the barbarians inhabiting Asia. Even in victory, he could not resist a jab at Sparta for refusing to join his campaign. After the Granicus, the coastal cities of Asia Minor began to fall like dominoes. Some surrendered immediately, welcoming Alexander as a liberator from Persian rule. Others resisted and were taken by siege. Alexander was a master of siege warfare, perhaps the greatest of his age. He had learned from his father's campaigns and from the engineers and architects in his army. Wherever there was a city with walls, he found a way to breach them, with siege towers and battering rams, with undermining and assault, with patience and persistence. But he was not just a destroyer. In each city he captured, he established a Greek-style government, promised freedom from Persian taxes, and encouraged trade. He was painting himself not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. And in many ways, he was. The Persian Empire had ruled these Greek cities for generations, extracting tribute and imposing their will. Now Alexander offered them something different: membership in a Greek world united under Macedonian leadership. The cities of Asia Minor were just the beginning. Alexander moved south along the coast, securing his supply lines, capturing ports so the Persian fleet would have nowhere to land. It was a brilliant strategy. Rather than trying to defeat the Persian navy at sea, where they were stronger, he would defeat them by taking away every harbor they might use. While he marched, the Persian king Darius was assembling an enormous army in the heart of the empire, preparing to crush this upstart Macedonian once and for all. They met in battle in November of 333 BCE at a place called Issus, a narrow coastal plain between the mountains and the sea. Darius had made a mistake in his strategy. He had moved his vast army into a constricted space where his superior numbers would count for less. The ancient sources claim Darius had perhaps 100,000 men, though modern historians think the number was probably smaller, maybe 60,000 or 70,000. Still, it was a huge force compared to Alexander's 40,000. The Battle of Issus became one of the most famous battles in history. It was painted and sculpted countless times in antiquity. You may have seen images of the Alexander mosaic from Pompeii, showing the moment when Alexander and Darius locked eyes across the battlefield. Alexander led his cavalry in a devastating charge, as he always did, aiming directly for the Persian king. He smashed through the Persian left wing, and then turned and drove toward the center where Darius stood in his chariot, surrounded by his bodyguards. The accounts say that Alexander and Darius were briefly face to face, that their eyes met across the chaos of battle. And then Darius fled. Whether he was cowardly or simply realistic, whether he thought he could save what remained of his army by living to fight another day, or whether he simply panicked in that moment, we will never know. But Darius turned his chariot and fled from the battlefield, and when the Persian soldiers saw their king retreat, the battle became a rout. Thousands of Persians died in the retreat, cut down by Alexander's pursuing cavalry. Thousands more were captured. And in the Persian camp, abandoned in the flight, Alexander found something precious: Darius's family. The Persian king's mother, his wife, and his 2 daughters had been traveling with the army, as was the custom. Now they were captives. The Persian queens threw themselves at Alexander's feet, begging for mercy, mistaking Hephaestion for the king because he was taller. When they realized their error, they were terrified, but Alexander spoke kindly to them. he told them they would not be harmed. He addressed Darius's mother as mother and treated the royal women with the greatest respect. He saw to it that they were housed in comfort, that their servants and attendants remained with them, that they were treated as queens, not as slaves. This act of mercy and courtesy made a profound impression throughout the Persian Empire. Here was a conqueror who honored the old ways, who respected royalty even when they were his enemies. It was a political masterstroke, but it also seems to have been genuine. Alexander had been raised to respect women of noble birth, and he kept his word to these captive queens for the rest of his life. After Issus, Alexander did not pursue Darius immediately into the heart of Persia. Instead, he turned south. His strategy was clear. He would secure the entire coast of the Mediterranean before advancing inland. This meant conquering Phoenicia and Egypt, eliminating any base from which the Persian fleet might operate. Most of the Phoenician cities surrendered without a fight. But not Tyre. Tyre was an ancient city, perhaps the most famous city in the world at that time for trade and seafaring. It was built on an island half a mile from the coast, surrounded by massive walls. It had never been taken by force. The Tyrians, confident in their impregnable position, refused Alexander's demand to surrender. They killed his ambassadors, an unforgivable insult. Alexander laid siege to the city, but how do you besiege an island fortress when you have no fleet? Alexander's answer was characteristically audacious. He would build a causeway from the mainland to the island. For 7 months his army labored, dragging rocks and timber, filling in the sea, building a road to Tyre through the water itself. The Tyrians attacked the workers, set fire to the siege engines, killed the laborers. Alexander persisted. He assembled a fleet from the Phoenician cities that had surrendered, and he used it to guard his causeway and attack the city walls. He built siege towers on the causeway, 200 feet high, wheeling them forward to the walls of Tyre. Finally, in July of 332 BCE, after 7 brutal months, the walls were breached. Alexander's soldiers poured into the city, and their vengeance was terrible. The Tyrians had resisted too long, had killed too many Macedonians. The city was sacked, thousands were killed, and tens of thousands were sold into slavery. 2,000 Tyrian soldiers were crucified along the beach. It was a brutal statement. Resistance would not be tolerated. But Alexander also showed his usual mix of mercy and politics. Those who had taken sanctuary in the temples were spared, and the king of Tyre was treated with honor. The causeway Alexander built remained, and over time, it widened with sand and silt deposits, until Tyre was no longer an island at all. To this day, Tyre is connected to the mainland, a permanent monument to Alexander's determination. From Tyre, Alexander marched to Egypt. The Egyptians, who had been unhappy Persian subjects for generations, welcomed him with open arms. He was crowned pharaoh in Memphis, becoming a god-king according to Egyptian tradition. He traveled to the oracle of Amun at the Siwa oasis, deep in the western desert, a journey of hundreds of miles through burning sands. What happened at Siwa remains one of history's mysteries. The priests of Amun greeted Alexander as the son of their god. Whether this was a standard greeting for Egyptian pharaohs, or whether Alexander believed he truly was divine, or whether he simply found it politically useful to claim divine ancestry, we cannot say. But from that moment on, Alexander styled himself as the son of Zeus Amun, and he had coins minted showing himself with ram's horns, the symbol of the god. In Egypt, on the Mediterranean coast, Alexander founded the most famous of all the cities that bore his name, Alexandria. He personally marked out where the walls should go, where the main avenues should run, where the harbors and temples should be built. He planned a city that would be a jewel of the Mediterranean, a center of trade and learning, a bridge between Greece and Egypt. He would never see his city completed. He moved on too quickly, always pressing forward. But Alexandria grew into everything he had dreamed and more, becoming one of the greatest cities of the ancient world, home to the famous library and the Pharos lighthouse, another of the seven wonders. In 331 BCE, after more than a year securing the coast and Egypt, Alexander was finally ready to march into the heart of the Persian Empire. Darius had used the time well, assembling another massive army, even larger than the one at Issus. They met at Gaugamela in northern Mesopotamia, near the ancient city of Nineveh. Darius had chosen the battlefield carefully, a vast, flat plain where his chariots and superior numbers could be used to best effect. He had the ground leveled to make it easier for his scythed chariots to charge. The armies that faced each other at Gaugamela were astonishing in their scope. Darius supposedly had over 200,000 men, though again, modern historians think the real number was probably smaller, perhaps 100,000. But even so, Alexander was outnumbered at least 2-1, perhaps 3-1. The Persian army included cavalry from every corner of the empire, from Bactria and Sogdiana in the Far East, from India, from Syria and Cappadocia. There were the fearsome scythed chariots and even war elephants. There were infantry from a dozen different nations, warriors who spoke different languages and worshipped different gods, all united under the banner of the great king. The night before the battle, Alexander's generals urged him to attack under cover of darkness, to use surprise to offset the Persian numerical advantage. But Alexander refused. He said he would not steal his victory, that he would defeat Darius in open battle where everyone could see. Perhaps it was pride, perhaps confidence, perhaps a desire for glory. Whatever the reason, he slept soundly that night while his officers paced with worry. The Battle of Gaugamela was fought on October 1st, 331 BCE, and it decided the fate of the Persian Empire. Once again, Alexander employed his favorite tactic. He drew the Persian forces out of position with feints and attacks on the flanks, creating a gap in their lines. And then, as he had at Issus, as he had at Granicus, he led his companion cavalry in a devastating charge, driving like a spear point directly toward Darius. The Persian king tried to stand his ground this time, but Alexander was unstoppable. His cavalry smashed through the Persian guard, and once again, Darius fled. The battle dissolved into a rout, with Persians dying by the thousands as they tried to escape. Alexander pursued Darius, determined to capture the great king and end the war decisively. But Darius was faster, and he knew the country. He escaped to the east, to the satrapies of Bactria and Sogdiana, the wild frontier regions where the Persian Empire met the steppes and mountains. Alexander would eventually find him, but not as he expected. With Darius fleeing, the great cities of Mesopotamia opened their gates to Alexander. Babylon, one of the most ancient and magnificent cities in the world, surrendered without a fight. Alexander entered in triumph, riding in a chariot through streets lined with flowers and smoking incense. The priests of Marduk crowned him king of Babylon, and he made generous offerings to their temples. He was learning how to rule an empire, respect the local gods, respect the local customs, present yourself as the rightful successor to the ancient dynasties, rather than as a foreign conqueror. From Babylon, Alexander marched to Susa and then to Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of the Persian Empire. Persepolis was breathtaking, a city of palaces built by Darius the Great and his son Xerxes, decorated with magnificent reliefs showing the great king receiving tribute from every nation of his empire. Alexander found treasures beyond imagination there. Gold and silver accumulated over 2 centuries of Persian rule, worth perhaps 120,000 talents, an almost incomprehensible sum. 1 talent of gold was about 26 kilograms, so we are talking about tons and tons of precious metal, enough to finance Alexander's campaigns for years to come. But then something unexpected happened. After months in Persepolis, Alexander set fire to the great palace of Xerxes. The ancient sources disagree about why. Some say it was deliberate revenge for the Persian destruction of Athens 150 years earlier, a symbolic act to show that the Greek invasion of Persia was complete. Others say it happened during a drunken revel, that Alexander was encouraged by a Greek courtesan named Thais to burn the palace as retribution for past Persian crimes. Still, others suggest he came to regret it almost immediately, that it was a fit of anger or drunkenness that he wished he could take back. Whatever the reason, the burning of Persepolis marked a turning point in Alexander's campaign. Up until then, he could claim to be a liberator, a Greek come to free his people from Persian rule. But burning the Persian capital suggested something else: conquest, the replacement of one empire with another. The symbolism was not lost on the Persians who remained. Some would continue to resist, not to restore Darius, but to fight against a foreign invader. Alexander pressed on, pursuing Darius into the eastern reaches of the empire. In the summer of 330 BCE, he finally caught up with the great king, but it was too late. Darius had been betrayed and murdered by his own nobles, led by Bessus, the satrap of Bactria. They had hoped to win favor with Alexander by removing Darius, or perhaps to set up independent kingdoms in the east. Instead, Alexander was furious. Whatever Darius had been, his enemy, his rival, he had been a king, and he deserved a better end. Alexander had the conspirators hunted down and executed in the Persian manner, and he gave Darius a royal funeral, burying him with all the honors of a great king. It was another political masterstroke. Alexander presented himself as the avenger of Darius, the rightful heir to the Persian throne, not simply a conqueror, but the legitimate king of kings. But if Alexander thought the war was over, he was mistaken. The eastern satrapies of the Persian Empire, Bactria, Sogdiana, the lands we now call Afghanistan and parts of Central Asia, would not submit so easily. For the next 3 years, from 330 to 327 BCE, Alexander fought the most difficult campaign of his life. These were not set-piece battles between armies on open plains. This was guerrilla warfare in brutal terrain. High mountains, trackless deserts, fortified valleys where every village had to be taken by storm. The local chiefs would submit to Alexander, then rebel as soon as he moved on. His army suffered terribly from the cold in the mountain winters and the heat in the desert summers. Soldiers froze to death in the high passes. Others died from thirst crossing the Gedrosian desert. Still others fell in ambushes, cut down by arrows from unseen archers, or died from infected wounds in a land where medicine was scarce, and the terrain made it impossible to properly care for the injured. During these campaigns, Alexander's character began to change, or perhaps we should say, the pressures of kingship and conquest began to show themselves more clearly. He adopted more and more Persian customs, wearing Persian dress, expecting his followers to perform proskinesis, the Persian custom of bowing before the king, which to Greeks seemed uncomfortably close to worshipping him as a god. His Macedonian companions grumbled. They had come to conquer Persia, not to become Persians. But Alexander was thinking on a larger scale. He was trying to unite Greeks and Persians into a single empire, to create something new in the world. He began to promote Persians to high positions in his army and administration. He married a Bactrian princess named Roxana, partly for love. The sources say she was beautiful, but also for politics, to cement an alliance with local rulers. But the tensions in his army grew. In 328 BCE, during a drunken feast at Samarkand, Alexander quarreled with Clytus, the man who had saved his life at Granicus years before. The argument was about Alexander's increasing adoption of Persian ways, about his treatment of the Macedonian Old Guard, about who got credit for the conquests. Tempers flared, fueled by wine, and suddenly Alexander grabbed a spear from a guard and ran Clytus through, killing him instantly. When he realized what he had done, when the wine-fueled rage cleared and he saw his old friend lying dead by his hand, Alexander was devastated. He locked himself in his tent for 3 days, refusing to eat or drink, weeping and calling himself a murderer. His companions finally convinced him to emerge, but the guilt would haunt him for the rest of his life. There were other dark moments in these years. A plot against Alexander was uncovered, or said to have been uncovered. Whether it was real or imagined, we cannot now say. Several of his companions were executed, including Philotas, one of his senior cavalry commanders, and Philotas's father, Parmenion, an old general who had served Philip and Alexander faithfully for decades. Parmenion was assassinated on Alexander's orders, hunted down and killed because Alexander feared he might avenge his son. These were brutal, paranoid acts, the kind of things that tyrants do. They cast a shadow over Alexander's achievements. Yet at the same time, Alexander could still inspire tremendous loyalty and devotion. When his army was suffering from thirst during a desert crossing, a group of soldiers found a little water and brought it to him in a helmet. Alexander took it, thanked them, and then poured it out onto the sand, saying he would not drink unless all his men could drink. Such gestures, whether calculated or spontaneous, kept his army devoted to him even through the worst hardships. By 327 BCE, Alexander had finally pacified, or at least subdued, the eastern satrapies. Now he looked beyond the known world to India. India was a land of legend to Greeks, a place of unimaginable wealth and strange wonders, elephants and exotic spices, wise men called gymnosophists, who lived naked in the forests and contemplated the divine, and the sacred river Indus that marked the edge of the civilized world. Alexander wanted to reach the end of the earth, to see what lay beyond the horizon, to go where no Greek had gone before. He led his army over the Hindu Kush, a brutal mountain range with passes that reached over 12,000 feet in elevation. In the spring of 326 BCE, he descended into India and began his conquest. Some local rulers welcomed him and allied with him. Others resisted. The most powerful was King Porus, who ruled the lands between the Hydaspes and Acesines rivers in what is now the Punjab. The Battle of the Hydaspes, fought in May or June of 326 BCE, was Alexander's last great battle, and in many ways his most impressive. Porus was waiting for him on the far side of the Hydaspes River, which was swollen with monsoon rains. Porus had an army that included perhaps 30,000 infantry, 4,000 cavalry, 300 war chariots, and 200 elephants, those enormous creatures that terrified horses and men alike. Alexander could not simply force a crossing. Porus would slaughter his men as they struggled through the river. So Alexander resorted to one of his most clever stratagems. For days he moved his forces up and down the riverbank, creating noise and commotion, threatening to cross in multiple places. Porus moved his forces to mirror Alexander's movements, exhausting his men. Then, on a stormy night, Alexander and a select force moved miles upriver, crossed at an unguarded ford, and suddenly appeared on Porus's flank. Porus had to pivot his entire army to face this new threat. The resulting battle was fierce. The Indian soldiers fought bravely, and the war elephants did terrible damage to Alexander's cavalry. But in the end, superior Macedonian discipline and tactics won out. Porus himself fought with incredible courage, continuing to direct his troops even after being wounded multiple times, towering on his elephant above the battlefield. When the battle was over, Porus was captured. Alexander asked him how he wished to be treated. "Treat me like a king," Porus replied, and Alexander did. He restored Porus to his kingdom, made him an ally, and even enlarged his territories. It was the kind of generous gesture that Alexander could make when he chose, the kind of thing that earned him devoted followers. But the army had had enough. They had been campaigning for 8 years, had marched thousands of miles from home, had crossed deserts and mountains, had fought in battles beyond counting. Now they were at the edge of the known world, rain pouring down day after day in the monsoon season, facing an endless succession of Indian kingdoms with endless numbers of those terrifying elephants. When Alexander told them he wanted to march on, to cross the Ganges and conquer all of India, his soldiers refused. They simply would not go further. It was perhaps the only time in his life that Alexander was truly defeated, not by an enemy, but by the exhaustion and homesickness of his own men. For 3 days he sulked in his tent, refusing to see anyone, hoping his soldiers would change their minds. They did not. Finally, he accepted the inevitable. He made a great sacrifice to the gods at the banks of the Hephaestus River, erected altars to mark the furthest point of his advance, and turned back. But he was determined not to simply retrace his steps. Instead, he would explore the Indus River all the way to the sea, sailing and marching through lands no Greek had ever seen. The journey down the Indus took 9 months, and was filled with battles against tribes who resisted this foreign army passing through their lands. In one assault on a city of the Mali people, Alexander was nearly killed. He leapt over the city wall ahead of his men, found himself cut off with only 2 or 3 companions, and fought desperately against overwhelming odds. An arrow struck him in the chest, penetrating his lung. He collapsed, and his companions had to fight off the enemy while the rest of the army battered down the gates to reach him. The Macedonians were so furious at seeing their king wounded that they massacred the entire population of the city. Alexander hovered near death for days, and when he finally recovered enough to show himself to his army, there was rejoicing throughout the camp. Eventually, in 325 BCE, Alexander reached the Indian Ocean. He had achieved something no conqueror from the West had done before. He had marched an army from the Mediterranean to India and back. Now came the journey home. Alexander split his forces. Part of the army, under his general Craterus, would take a northern route through the more familiar territories. Alexander himself, with another portion of the army, would march west through the Gedrosian Desert, one of the most inhospitable places on earth. He did this partly to explore, partly to resupply a fleet that was sailing along the coast under his admiral Nearchus, and partly, one suspects, because it was there, because it was dangerous, because no one had done it before. The march through Gedrosia was a catastrophe. Men and animals died by the thousands from heat and thirst. They ran out of food and had to slaughter their baggage animals. They ran out of water and walked through burning sands with their lips cracked and bleeding, their eyes red with sand and sun. It was the worst disaster of Alexander's campaigns, and it was entirely avoidable, born of his own hubris and restlessness. When Alexander finally straggled back to Persia in early 324 BCE, having been away for 7 years, he found his empire in disorder. Governors had abused their power, assuming Alexander would never return. Treasuries had been looted. Some satraps had raised private armies, perhaps planning to set themselves up as independent kings. Alexander dealt with the corruption ruthlessly. Guilty officials were executed, and he appointed new governors, many of them Persians. He was serious about creating a unified empire that blended Greek and Persian elements. To this end, he arranged a mass wedding at Susa. He and 80 of his senior officers married Persian noblewomen in a great ceremony that combined Greek and Persian customs. Alexander himself married Statera, the daughter of the dead king Darius, uniting the Macedonian and Persian royal houses. 10,000 of his soldiers also took Persian wives. He was trying to create a new kind of empire, one where Greek and Persian, West and East, could live together as equals. But many of his Macedonians hated these policies. They had come to conquer Persia, not to marry into it. They grumbled about Alexander's Persian dress, his Persian advisors, his promotion of Persian soldiers into the army. When Alexander announced he would discharge his oldest veterans and send them home with rich rewards, they mutinied. They thought he was replacing them with Persians, that he had forgotten his own people. Alexander was furious. He had his ringleaders arrested and executed, then locked himself in his quarters, refusing to see anyone. After a few days, his Macedonian soldiers broke down. They came to him weeping, begging forgiveness, saying they could not bear his anger. Alexander wept with them, and there was a great reconciliation. He held a vast feast, 9,000 guests, where Macedonians and Persians sat together, and he prayed for harmony between the two peoples. It was a remarkable vision, centuries ahead of its time, an attempt to create a cosmopolitan world empire that transcended tribal loyalties. In the spring of 323 BCE, Alexander was in Babylon, planning his next campaigns. He wanted to explore Arabia, perhaps to conquer Carthage in North Africa, to push west to the Pillars of Hercules, what we call the Strait of Gibraltar, and see what lay beyond. His mind was always reaching forward, always seeking new horizons, but his body was failing. He had been wounded repeatedly in battles, sword cuts, arrow wounds, fractures. He had driven himself mercilessly for years, sleeping little, always moving. He drank heavily, as Macedonian nobles did, and the drinking was taking its toll. In early June, after a long night of feasting and drinking, Alexander fell ill. At first, it seemed like a fever, something that would pass, but it did not pass. Day by day, he grew weaker. The fever raged, and he could not keep down food or water. His officers and friends gathered around him, desperate, praying to the gods. The army, hearing their king was dying, demanded to see him. They filed past his bed, one by one, thousands of soldiers who had followed him from Macedonia to India, and Alexander, too weak to speak, raised his hand to each in farewell. On June 10th or 11th, 323 BCE, Alexander the Great died in Babylon. He was 32 years old. In just 13 years of active campaigning, he had conquered the largest empire the world had ever known, from Greece to India, from Egypt to Central Asia. He had founded dozens of cities, spread Greek culture across the ancient world, and changed the course of history forever. The question everyone wanted to know was, who would succeed him? Alexander's generals asked him on his deathbed, "To whom do you leave your kingdom?" According to legend, he whispered, to the strongest. Or perhaps he said, to Kratistos, which could mean to the strongest, or could have been an attempt to say Craterus, one of his generals. We will never know for certain. What we do know is that Alexander left no clear successor. His half-brother Aridaeus was mentally incompetent. His wife Roxana was pregnant and would give birth to a son, Alexander IV, a few months after his father's death. But an infant could not rule. Alexander's empire was too large, too diverse, too dependent on his personal leadership to survive intact. Within days of his death, his generals were quarreling over who would control what. These men, Ptolemy, Seleucus, Antigonus, Cassander, Lysimachus, Perdiccas, had been Alexander's companions, his friends, his trusted officers. Now they became rivals. The wars of the Diadochi, the successors, would last for decades, tearing apart Alexander's empire in a series of brutal conflicts. Eventually, the empire would fragment into several large kingdoms: Ptolemaic Egypt, Seleucid Persia, Antigonid Macedon, and several smaller states. These Hellenistic kingdoms would dominate the Mediterranean and Near East for centuries, until Rome finally conquered them all. But what was Alexander's legacy? He was one of the greatest military commanders who ever lived, perhaps the greatest. He never lost a battle. He pioneered new tactics and strategies, combining different types of forces in innovative ways. He understood logistics and supply lines. He could read terrain and exploit his enemy's weaknesses. And he had that indefinable quality of leadership that made men willing to follow him through any hardship, to the ends of the earth. But he was more than just a conqueror. He spread Greek culture, what we call Hellenistic culture, across 3 continents. The cities he founded became centers of learning and trade. Greek became the common language of the Eastern Mediterranean and the Near East, allowing ideas and commerce to flow more freely than ever before. The Library of Alexandria, founded in the city he created, would become the greatest repository of knowledge in the ancient world. Greek philosophy, science, art, and literature blended with Egyptian, Persian, and Indian traditions, creating new and vibrant cultures. Alexander's conquests also opened the East to the West in ways that had never been possible before. Trade routes were established between the Mediterranean and India. Ideas traveled along those routes. Greek mathematics reached India, while Indian astronomy and medicine reached Greece. The fusion of cultures that Alexander began would bear fruit for centuries. Buddhism would spread west along trade routes that Alexander's campaigns had opened. Greek artistic styles would influence the Buddhist art of Central Asia, creating the Gandhara style that shows Buddha dressed in Greek robes. Yet there is darkness in his legacy too. He was responsible for the deaths of tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands, in his wars of conquest. He destroyed cities and enslaved their populations. He could be cruel and ruthless when he thought it necessary. And toward the end of his life, he showed signs of paranoia and megalomania, executing old friends on suspicion of disloyalty, demanding that people treat him as divine. The brilliant young king who had studied philosophy with Aristotle at Mieza, who had wept at the bravery of his enemies, who had shown mercy to defeated kings, sometimes gave way to a harder, darker figure, corrupted perhaps by power and the intoxication of endless victory. His vision of a unified empire of Greeks and Persians, while noble, was ultimately impractical in his time. The cultural barriers were too great, the prejudices too deep. His Macedonians and Greeks never truly accepted his Persian subjects as equals, and many Persians saw him as a foreign conqueror, no matter how much he dressed in their clothes and respected their customs. And yet, And yet, there is something undeniably extraordinary about Alexander. He had a quality of daring, of imagination, of sheer force of will that changed the world. He believed he could do the impossible, and often he did. He had a vision of human potential that went beyond the narrow confines of his own culture. He sought to unite peoples, not merely to conquer them. He was fascinated by the world and wanted to explore it, to understand it, to push back the boundaries of the known. Think of this. He was 20 when he became king, 32 when he died. In those 12 years, he achieved more than most people could in several lifetimes. He inspired loyalty and devotion in his followers that lasted long after his death. When Ptolemy, one of his generals, established his kingdom in Egypt, he had Alexander's body brought to Alexandria and buried there in a magnificent tomb, because even dead, Alexander's presence conferred legitimacy. Roman generals like Julius Caesar and Pompey would visit that tomb centuries later and weep, comparing their own achievements to Alexander's and finding themselves wanting. Stories about Alexander spread throughout the ancient world and beyond. He became a legendary figure, not just in Greece and Rome, but in Persia, in India, in Egypt. Medieval Christians told stories about him. Muslims incorporated him into their traditions as Iskandar, a prophet and a wise king. The Romance of Alexander, a medieval tale of his adventures, was translated into dozens of languages and read from England to Ethiopia. He became one of the 9 worthies, the greatest heroes of history, alongside figures like King Arthur and Charlemagne. Why did he capture the imagination so completely? Perhaps because his story has everything a story needs: a young hero, a destiny foretold by oracles, impossible challenges overcome, great battles and victories, loyal friends and tragic betrayals, a quest to the ends of the earth, and an early death at the height of power and glory. It is the story of Achilles made real, the story of a man who chose glory over long life and got exactly what he sought. But beyond the legend, there was a real person. A young man who loved Homer and philosophy, who could be generous and cruel, brave and paranoid, far-seeing and reckless, who loved his friends deeply. His devotion to Hephaestion was legendary, and when Hephaestion died of a fever in 324 BCE, less than a year before Alexander's own death, Alexander was inconsolable. He had Hephaestion's doctor executed, held elaborate funeral games, and supposedly wrote to the oracle of Amun, asking that Hephaestion be declared a god. The grief was not entirely rational, but it was deeply human. He was a man who pushed himself and everyone around him to their limits and beyond, who could not rest, could not be satisfied with what he had achieved, always needing to see what lay over the next mountain, beyond the next river. That restless energy, that refusal to accept limits, it made him great, and it also contributed to his early death. If he had been more moderate, more willing to consolidate what he had, rather than always reaching for more, he might have lived longer, might have built something more lasting. But then he would not have been Alexander. There is a story told about his last days that may or may not be true, but it captures something essential about him. When his officers asked who should receive his kingdom, and he supposedly answered, "To the strongest," there was a moment of silence. Then someone asked, "What of you, Alexander? What will be your memorial?" And he replied, "When you hear of my death, you will build great monuments and make offerings. But the greatest monument to me will be in the hearts of men who dare to do what they thought impossible." Whether he actually said this, we cannot know. But it fits the man we glimpse through the ancient sources, someone who wanted to be remembered, not just for what he built, but for inspiring others to dream large dreams, to dare greatly, to push beyond the boundaries of what seems possible. As we come to the end of our journey through Alexander's life, we might reflect on what he means to us today, more than 2,000 years after his death. He was neither saint nor monster, but a human being of extraordinary gifts and terrible flaws. He united cultures and destroyed them. He spread learning and enlightenment while leaving death and devastation in his wake. He dreamed of a world without boundaries and built an empire through violence. Perhaps the lesson of Alexander's life is about the nature of greatness itself, that it is never simple, never pure. Great achievements come with great costs, the same qualities that make someone extraordinary. The ambition, the confidence, the refusal to accept limits can also lead them into darkness. Alexander conquered the world, but could not conquer his own demons. He spread Greek civilization across continents, but could not make Greeks and Persians truly brothers. He sought immortality through glory and achieved it, but at the cost of his life, his empire, and the lives of countless others. And yet, when we think of what one person can do, of how one life can change the course of history, we cannot help but think of Alexander. For better and worse, he made the world we live in. The Hellenistic culture he spread shaped the Roman Empire, which in turn shaped medieval Europe, which shaped the modern world. The trade routes he opened, the cities he founded, the cultural exchanges he began, these had ripple effects that touched everything that came after. So tonight, as we finish our story of Alexander the Great, we might do what he loved to do. Imagine what lies beyond the horizon. Not lands to conquer, but possibilities to explore. Not peoples to subjugate, but understanding to seek. Not glory through violence, but greatness through creation. Perhaps that is the best way to honor his memory. To take the restless energy, the boundless curiosity, the refusal to accept that anything is impossible that made Alexander who he was, and channel it toward building rather than destroying, toward understanding rather than conquering, toward uniting humanity not through empire, but through empathy. Alexander died at 32, but his story has lived for over 2 millennia and will live as long as people tell stories. He remains a figure of fascination and debate, of admiration and criticism, a reminder of both the extraordinary potential of the human spirit and its terrible capacity for destruction. He was many things: king and conqueror, visionary and tyrant, student of philosophy and master of war, man and myth. But mostly, he was someone who refused to accept the world as it was and had the courage, or perhaps the hubris, to reshape it according to his own vision. Whether we judge that vision as noble or horrific, whether we see him as hero or villain, we cannot deny that he mattered, that he changed history in ways that still echo today. And so we leave Alexander where he began, in a palace far away and long ago, in a world of gods and heroes, of bronze and iron, of kings and conquerors. We leave him at 32, forever young, forever reaching for the impossible, forever the boy who tamed a wild horse by understanding its fear, the student who loved Homer's heroes, the king who wept at the tombs of the fallen, the conqueror who believed he could unite the world. His body lies in an unknown grave, somewhere in Egypt, or perhaps lost forever. But his story remains, passed down through the centuries, changing with each telling yet always recognizable, always compelling, always challenging us to ask, What would we dare to do if we truly believed nothing was impossible? What would we achieve if we pushed ourselves as hard as Alexander pushed himself? And perhaps most importantly, what kind of greatness would we choose to pursue? These are questions for another night, for another story. For now, let us rest, knowing that the world Alexander knew is long gone, that empires rise and fall, that even the greatest conquerors return to dust. But the human qualities he embodied, courage, curiosity, ambition, loyalty, the desire for greatness, these remain with us still, waiting for each generation to discover them anew and decide what to do with them. Sleep well tonight and dream of distant horizons, of roads not yet traveled, of possibilities waiting to be explored. Dream of being young and bold, standing at the edge of the known world with everything before you. Dream of Bucephalus and companion cavalry, of cities bearing your name, of friends who would follow you anywhere. And when you wake tomorrow, remember that Alexander's greatest achievement was not the empire he built, but the reminder he left us. That we are capable of far more than we know, that the world is larger and stranger and more wonderful than we imagine, and that a single life, lived with purpose and passion, can echo through the ages. That is the story of Alexander the Great, king of Macedon, conqueror of Persia, explorer of the East, builder of cities, destroyer of empires, student of philosophy, friend of Hephaestion, son of Philip and Olympias, beloved of his soldiers, enemy of his enemies, and forever young in the stories we tell. May you rest peacefully tonight, and may your dreams be filled with wonder.